everyone, and welcome to another Top Tip Tuesday video from me, Sarah Amos, from the Pottery Corner, my studio down on the south coast of England near Chichester. So today we are going to be discussing the differences between slip, underglaze and glaze. And I think this is probably the most confusing thing for beginner potters to get their heads around, and it isn't really surprising because it's very confusing. So I thought if I did a quickish run through of the uses of the difference between slip, underglaze and then glaze, and then it would just give you an overview of what you can use on what. So starting off with slip. Now you will be familiar with slip because you will use it as the glue to join your pieces together. So when you scratch your work and then you slip it, the slip is the glue that's joining the two pieces together. So slip is basically the clay body that you're working with, so the clay just mixed with water, as simple as that. And obviously we use quite a lot of slip in the studio with the students using it for their pieces. If I want to make a slip to use, sorry, I was just going to show you this. This is a black clay, although it doesn't look black at the moment, but when it's fired, it's a black clay. So this pot I am just kind of slaking down to make some black clay body slip. So that's what that is in there. And very nasty it looks too. So when I'm making my coloured slips to use on my work, so for instance this piece has been used for mocha diffusion, which I'll do another video on another time, but the base blue colour, this sort of turquoisey blue base colour, is a slip which was added to the piece in its greenware state. So this dish has not yet been fired. It hasn't been biscuit fired, so it is still in its greenware state. So that's what we call it when it's not fired. So this is now dry, ready to go in the biscuit kiln. So this piece has not been fired at all. And if the pieces have not been fired, you can apply slip, and you can colour your slips with pigment powders such as this. Now, depending on what clay body you're using, whether you're using an earthenware or a stoneware, will depend on whether you need a high fire or a low fire pigment colour. So I use all the clay in the studio is all stoneware, so we just use high fire pigments, and they come in just about as many colours as you could possibly ever want. And obviously you can then mix your own colours as well. So, you know, using the principle of yellow and blue makes green and red and yellow makes orange, etc., from when you were at primary school. So I have a lot of these powders. I use the powders in two ways. I won't confuse everybody by just adding another thing in. I do colour my clay and then make marbled items with the clay. So for instance, this marbled mug has had marbled coloured clay to make that, but I'll do that in another video as well. So if you're making slip, it needs to be sieved. So I have a very fine sieve that sits in this bucket, which of course I should have picked up and didn't, sits in this bucket, and then I sieve the slip. And the reason that I sieve it is that the clay that we use in the studio is this hand building clay, has quite a lot of what's called grog, and grog is fine powder of biscuited clay, so something that has already been fired, munched up into tiny dust particles almost, and added to clay to give it more stability for hand building. So I don't want all that sand in my slip, so I sieve it. And then once I have sieved it, I put it into empty glaze pots. So we use these glazed pots in the studio, and they're really useful to reuse for slip, so don't throw them away. And then I add 20, my recipe, inverted commas, is 20 grams of pigment stain powder to 350 grams of thick slip. So when I say thick slip, I'm talking yoghurt consistency rather than double cream or single cream. I use yoghurt consistency. I can then water that down if I want to make it thinner or whatever, but I use 350 grams of yoghurt consistency sieved slip to 20 grams of high fire stain powder, and then I mix it together in these glaze pots, and this is what you get. So you get a coloured liquid clay, and that can be added to your work only at the greenware stage, so only on work that has not been previously fired. If you were to add slip to a fired piece of work, sorry, to a biscuit fired piece of work, it would just fall off in the kiln. That's it, simple. It would just come off because it doesn't have anything to adhere to. So you can only use slips on greenware. But, I mean, obviously there's a lot of ways that you can use it when it is on your greenware. Mocha diffusion being one of them, as I've just said. This one is a green slip, and you can see that the colour of the slip it's quite bold, and it is certainly a lot bolder once it is fired to it in its dry state. So this piece has not yet been fired. This is monoprinting, and again I'll do a video on that at some stage. So this piece of hand-built, this is a wonky pot, the same as a wonky pot like this one, but this one has been done with monoprinting. So all of the decoration on this unfired piece is slip. So when this is fired, the colours will be much more vibrant. So that's another thing to remember when you are making your pieces, that whilst your slip may not look terribly dark, this dish, this spoon rest, has been made from the same piece of clay, the mono-printed piece of clay, as this. So this is in the unfired state, so this needs to be biscuit fired. And this is the same piece of slab that has now been biscuit fired and glaze fired, and I've just popped a transparent glaze over the top. So you can see that when the colour comes out, it's very, very much more vibrant than it is in its unfired state. So when you're using the pigments, they're quite potent, so you don't need a lot of them. So don't think that when you're putting it on that the colours are dull, because when they come out, they're much, much brighter. And you might get caught out if you're using bright reds and bright greens, putting them on and thinking, ooh, you know, that's not much of a colour. And there's another example of that this lovely turquoise inside this Mocha Diffusion dish, this is that slip. So you can see that the slip colour in the bottle is nothing like the fired finished colour of the slip. So bear that in mind when you're using it. It will come out much brighter when you actually fire the work. So don't go too mad on your pigments. You can apply slip to pieces with a syringe. These can be bought really easily online. You know, I mean, they're just very, very simple to use. You just put the whole syringe into your slip bucket and pull it up and fill it with slip. And then you can drizzle it. And there's lots of people that do drippy mugs and things, so I'm sure if you look on YouTube, you'll find those. I just wanted to see what the colours of the slip would come out like. So there's 3 different blues on here. I wanted to see how bright they were before I used them on a larger piece, so that I knew how the finished article looks. So that's just really a sort of a test piece. But you can see that they're really quite vivid, but they're beautiful. Get more of a sort of a dense colour. So that is slip. So all of that on this side of the table is slip, only to be used on unfired work. Underglazes. Underglazes do what they say on the tin. They go under the glaze. Now, the very confusing thing about underglazes is they can be used at the greenware stage. So the unfired work, you can use underglazes on unfired work as well as on bisqueware, which confuses the matter quite markedly for beginners, because you're like, well, it says it's under the glaze and glazing is done at the biscuitware stage, but you can use underglazes on unfired work. I find it smudges if you use it on unfired work. It's just a personal preference. I tend to use underglazes on bisqueware. So there are lots and lots of colours of underglazes. I use the Amico Velvet Underglazes, and this is my sort of test piece. So on this bowl, this is underglazes that have no glaze on them at all. So if you didn't put a glaze on them, that is how they would come out. And on this edge, as you can see, there's about an inch where it has been fired with a transparent glaze, so that I can see what happens to the colour when it's got a transparent glaze over the top. And then on the back, I've just put the name of the underglaze. So it's quite a good way of doing your test tile for underglazes on a little bowl, because then of course you've got, you know, however many underglazes on one bowl, and it's easy to look it up. I always do a test tile. Well, I say that, I'll caveat that in a second. So I do a test tile again without any glaze on it at all, and with transparent glaze over the top, and that one is the flame yellow. So you can see that the colour that is in the bottle is very similar to the finished fired, glaze fired piece. So if you're using underglazes in your work, it gives you an absolute colour. Much better, you can tell when you're painting it how it's going to come out. Much better than the slips, which, as I say, you've got this issue of the slips not being quite so bright until they're fired. The only thing I would say is that I bought this purple underglaze, which again is an Amico, so, you know, having bought lots of Amicos and they've all been fine. This purple one, which is, as you can see, it's quite purple. I didn't do a test tile and used it on something, and then did the test tile afterwards. Now, that to me is not purple. So this is it without any glaze on that side, and with the transparent glaze on that side. So I'm going to say be careful with underglazes. Most of the time, 90% of the time, they will come out the colour that they are in the pot, but don't get caught out. Do your test tiles, because that will save you ruining a piece that you may have been working on for a long time. These are underglaze pencils. So these are they look like pastels. So these are underglaze pencils, so you can use them to draw lines and what have you. And they're just easier to use sometimes than a small brush if you want to pop some lines on. So they come in a little box, and they're called underglaze pencils, and you know, those are quite useful. I don't use them a lot myself, but they are quite useful. Now, glaze, you can use underglaze, as I say, on unfired work and biscuit work, so you can use it on both. Glaze goes on to biscuit fired work. So this bowl has been fired in the kiln to biscuit firing, and I use a white clay body, as you can see. And I like to use a white clay body because it shows up the glazes. It shows up the glaze colour. You're not fighting against the base colour of the clay when you're using your glazes. So this particular bowl has been biscuit fired, and then the glazes, I'll just pour those in so that you can see them. I use mostly Amico Potter's Choice and Amico Celadon glazes, because I find that they come out true, and I like a lot of colour. So when I'm using the glazes, I like the colour that I get from the Amaco, and I also like the fact that you can mix glazes. You can mix the actual glaze liquid together to make another colour, or you can layer the glazes and that will give you yet another colour. So they're very versatile, but again, test tiles, always test tiles. So I do a test tile of each new glaze as it actually arrives in the studio, and I just make a little textured cookie. You'll find a Top Tip Tuesday video on making cookies. So I use a textured cookie so that I can see how the glaze pools. And then each of my glazes is obviously, it just has its name on the top, so I can find it in the drawer with the 50 or 60 other glazes that I may have. A little bit of a glaze obsession, I will admit. So these are glaze is only used on biscuit fired work. So once it has been through the first firing, then you would add your glaze. And I use, as I say, I use mostly Amaco Potter's Choice and Celadon glazes, but I have branched out into some of the Mako glazes. I can't say personally that I find the Mako glazes as easy to use as the Amaco. Isn't it confusing when one is Amaco and the other one is Mako? Why couldn't they have called it something completely different? So I do, as I say, I do test tiles. So that one is Amaco's, sorry, no, that's Mako's Aurora Green. So this one is what I call a fancy Mako. So it's got other bits and pieces in it. And this one is called Meadow. And inside the glaze is a glass frit. And when it's fired, it gives you this kind of speckledy look. So you can have fun choosing what type of glazes you want to use on your work. But as I say, always, always take a test tile, because sometimes what it says on the tin in terms of sort of colour is completely different when you actually use it in your own studio. So be careful, test tile always, even if you're desperate to glaze something. And obviously if you've made a large item like this, which has been thrown, and then I've altered the handles, I've spent quite a lot of time on this piece, throwing it, trimming it, doing the handles. I mean, I've probably already put in a couple of hours work at least on this one piece. So having done all that work, if I put a glaze on that I don't know is going to turn out a particular way,